I beheld, when he opened up the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. In the last few years, we've been pondering the idea that Psalm 90 verse 10 teaches, that we will be raptured, that is, fly away, 70 to 80 years after God gave us the sign of the fig tree, that is, Israel's rebirth in the year 1948. If true, it means that the untimely figs of Revelation 6 may begin to fall sometime between now and 2028, when this world will be destroyed. But before we examine more information about the timeline, let's examine some of the doctrines of the fig tree. In Matthew chapter 24, God used the fig tree as a sign that Israel's synagogues will not produce the fruits of repentance because she, like the New Testament church, committed abominations in the holy place, meaning that she forsook God's holy covenant. And when we go back to the Old Testament to learn more about the fig tree, we discover that Israel was judged because her priests committed abominations by worshiping the graven images of Baal Peor, according to Hosea chapter 9 verse 10. Consequently, God uses a dried up fig tree in Joel chapter 1 to warn the ministers and the priests of Israel that destruction is coming. Okay, so with that in mind, let's return to the New Testament. In Luke chapter 21, verse 29, we read that the fig tree and all the trees will shoot forth. And he spake to them a parable. Behold, the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. And recall from Jeremiah chapter 8, we learned that Israel, the fig tree, was not saved in summer because they worshiped graven images, which according to Revelation chapter 9 verse 20 means we are trying to become saved by our own works, such as circumcision, water baptism, or even accepting Jesus. In God's eyes, this sort of worship is akin to the worship of devils. But why does Luke chapter 21 verse 29 teach that all the trees will shoot forth in the lead up to summer? This shooting forth is recorded in Ezekiel chapter 17, where we read that the shooting forth of the trees represents Israel, which shot forth but rebelled against God by violating his covenant. And later in our study, we'll see that this rebellion relates to Zechariah, who was an evil fig. On the other hand, verse 22 speaks about a tender or weak twig that was cut from that same tree, but it grew to produce fruit. And we know that this represents Jeconiah, the good ripe fig, who humbled himself by obeying God's command to go down into Babylon. Another example of shooting forth in relation to salvation is found in Ezekiel 36, where we read that this fruit is a product of clean water, which cleanses us of idols and gives us a new heart and a new spirit so that we can keep God's commandments. And that is precisely why Daniel chapter 8 verse 14 reveals that God's elect began to cleanse their temples 2,300 days after 1994, that is in the year 2000 AD, when they began to leave the church. And so it was in the year 2000 AD that God began to pour out the latter rain. And according to Zechariah chapter 10 verse 1, the latter rain helps us cleanse ourselves of idols so that we might turn away from lies and false dreams. In other words, once we come out of the church, we are no longer following after the false works gospels or the false miracles, which include speaking in tongues, dreams, and visions, wherein Satan comes as an angel of light. So in this regard, rain represents the doctrine of God, which helps us to turn from error to truth, as we learned in James chapter 5. And that is precisely why Joel chapter 2 verses 22 indicates that the fig tree namely those who are associated with the children of Zion, that is God's elect, receive the early and latter rains. The early rain being those saved during the church age, and the latter rain being those saved at this present time of great tribulation. Okay, we have one last example of the fig tree in Jeremiah chapter 24, where God speaks about 2 baskets of fig trees in the temple, signifying that the focus is on the church. In verse 1 we read, "The Lord showed me, and behold, 2 baskets of figs were set before the temple of the Lord, after Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried captive Jeconiah the son of Jehoiakim." So in this context, God typifies Jeconiah as the first ripe good figs who were taken captive in 597 BC, but were promised that they would be planted and builded when they returned from Babylon. On the other hand, when God speaks about the evil figs, he compares them to Zedekiah, who refused to go down into Babylon, and as a result, he was blinded shortly after the temple was destroyed in 587 BC. And we learned some time ago that the year 587 BC points to the year 1994, when the abomination of desolation was set up in the church because she forsook his holy covenant. And so these evil or unripe figs are identified with the untimely figs, who will not be saved because they did not receive the latter rain. But we are very much interested in Jeconiah, who was one of the good figs, because he was taken captive along with the temple builders who were freed from captivity and worked to rebuild the temple in 517 BC, 80 years after they were taken captive in 597 BC. And so when we consider this period of 80 years in the light of Psalm chapter 90, we suspect that God is giving us 70 to 80 years from the year 1948 to plant the seeds of the gospel in hopes that it will produce fruit in all the trees, to include the fig tree. But sadly, Revelation chapter 6 informs us that the untimely or unripe figs, a figure of those in the church, will not become saved in summer, that is the harvest at the end of the world, because they reject the latter rain, which teaches that salvation is only made possible through the work and faith of Christ.